are you? And where are you going? What do you want?
Hello and welcome to Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and I'm here every Tuesday morning at 10 a.m. Pacific time to talk about military history, doctrine, and the practices of great military leaders so that we can distill from them lessons that we can apply to our businesses and professional practices. So today I'm going to be talking about Napoleon Bonaparte's Corps organization, Corps as in CORPS, Army Corps organization, and how this applies and makes the case for cross-functional business units, which allows our businesses to run more effectively, more efficiently, and gives us the opportunity to pivot and respond to the market in a much better way. So I think I've talked about Napoleon or aspects of Napoleon before. Napoleon Bonaparte is, of course, one of the greatest military leaders in human history. He lived around the he lived from the late 18th century into the roughly mid 19th century, so late 1700s to mid 1800s. And he was on two occasions, he was essentially the dictator of France. Now, France was called a République when Napoleon was dictator. But in reality, he controlled really what happened in the government. He has somewhat of a mixed history. If you read Western history, the English despised him because he was so effective in fighting them. During the early 1800s, one of the things that parents would do to scare their children into obedience was tell them, if you're not good, Boney will come to get you. Boney was the name they used in an insulting way for Napoleon Bonaparte. On the other hand, to have been a Jew in France during the reign of Napoleon Bonaparte meant you had extraordinary religious freedom. During that time, Napoleon was very respectful to the Jews. There is an apocryphal story told about him that he was walking through the streets of Paris one evening with some of his staff, and he walked by what turned out to be a synagogue, and he heard crying and wailing going on inside the synagogue, and he was very concerned about this. It was, by the way, around this time of year in what's called the 3 weeks in the Jewish calendar. It was actually on the last day of the 3 weeks, known as Tisha B'Av, the 9th of the Hebrew month of Av. And so he sent one of his staff into the synagogue to find out what was going on. And a little while later, the staffer came out and he said, my emperor, the Jews are mourning the loss of their temple. And Napoleon was a little bit puzzled by this. He said, their temple? He said, yes, my emperor. And he says, I need details. So he sent the man back in to get details. And a little while later, the staffer came back out, and he said, what is this temple about? He says, well, they're mourning the loss of their temple in Jerusalem 1800 years ago. And Napoleon supposedly replied by saying, any people that can still mourn so deeply the loss of the central place of their faith merits to be eternal. And the reason this story is told is to show the kind of respect that Napoleon Bonaparte had for Jews in France at this time. The French themselves, there were many Bonapartists in France at the time of Napoleon's reign, and they sincerely loved him and admired him. There was also an anti-Bonapartist faction, many of whom collaborated with the English in the eventual defeat and overthrow of Napoleon Bonaparte. So a very interesting character in history, especially in French history. He was, of course, known for carrying his hand in his vest. I don't know that that's historically accurate, but in any event, he was an innovative military commander. There's no question about that. And at the time that he came to power, which is the late 18th century and coming into the early 19th century, military structures were very rigid. So they were an absolute command down model of operations, which made them very rigid. And what Bonaparte figured out was, by creating his core system, he could decentralize authority to a pretty significant extent, especially given the times, and dramatically increase both the size and the effectiveness of his army. And so what he did was, Napoleon reorganized the French army into independent corps, each of which was essentially a mini army of roughly 20 to 30,000 troops. And instead of having one infantry corps and one cavalry corps and one artillery corps, what he did was he created an integrated corps, each of which had its own infantry, its own cavalry, its own artillery, its own engineers, its own logistics support. Okay, so each corps was self-sufficient and could fight on its own, at least for a short time. And each corps was led by a commander who had autonomy to direct his corps in battle, but he operated under the overall strategic direction of Napoleon, of the emperor. So what that did was it created a system whereby Napoleon could again set the strategy, but then, pardon me, depending on the local conditions and how the individual battles developed, the corps commanders could respond to these differing situations much more quickly. They didn't have to send up information to higher echelons until it got to the senior commander, who then decided what to do and sent it back down the chain of command. So as a result, these corps had greater speed and flexibility. They could march on different roads. They could converge quickly to create a more powerful force, but they could also disperse faster in order to take advantage of what was happening in the battle, and operate much more agilely than a single large army. They also they had decentralized execution. So Napoleon would set the objectives, but the corps commanders had the flexibility as to how they would achieve those objectives. And the last thing, and this is important as well, is by creating an army made up of a number of corps, the army itself had greater resilience. So if one corps got wiped out, the armies could still live on to fight another day. And so, and also if one corps got badly mauled, so another corps could be moved in behind it to carry on the battle, as opposed to the entire army feeling like, oh, we've been defeated, we're going to retreat, and therefore the morale of the entire army collapses. So I will say that if you continue to look forward into history, and you get all the way to World War II, for example, so this same system was reflected in the army organizations of both the Allies and the Axis during World War II. World War II is really the last time there were, major armies in the field. There was, to a lesser extent, in the Korean War and Vietnam, but nowhere near the scope that World War II had. And so, in World War II, you had corps commanders with a great deal of independents who then reported to the army commander. So, for example, George Patton, who was the commanding general of Third Army, he had a number of army corps within his structure, and that was one of the reasons why he could be so effective. Is he set the objectives, and then his corps commanders develop the operational plans, and then lower echelons develop the tactical plans necessary to meet the objectives. And that left Patton free to be out in the field, seeing how the battle was developing. And then as he watched that, he could alter his objectives, or in many cases, just set further objectives based on how quickly the battle was developing and how fast his army was able to gain territory. So Napoleon's core system became the organizational system of armies in the West, for certain. So let's now take a look at what our core. I'm sorry. What are cross-functional business units? You may not be familiar with this term, and it's obviously this show is about comparing Napoleon's core system to CFBU's, core cross-functional business unit. So understanding the two are important. So a cross-functional business unit is a multidisciplinary team within a company. So if you think about the way that most companies are organized, you have the C-suite, or the sort of leadership part of it, and then you have manufacturing, and you have marketing, and you have sales, and you have finance, and each one of these departments operates as part of the overall company. Okay, in a cross-functional business unit, okay, within the company, you have this multidisciplinary team where it has its own marketing, its own sales, its own leadership team, its own finance. Okay, so it oftentimes has its own engineering team. It may even have its own manufacturing team. I'll give you some examples of cross-functional business units in a minute. So, but the idea of the cross-functional business unit is it has autonomy within the larger company or corporate structure. So it can make decisions without necessarily having, not without relying on, headquarters, corporate to approve every move. Okay. So again, senior leadership sets the objective, and the CFBU really has autonomy to figure out how it's going to meet that objective. Okay, and its focus is typically around delivering value to a specific consumer segment, or a specific product, or a specific region. I'll give you some examples of those in a minute. And then finally, it has its own accountability metrics. So it often is responsible for its own profit and loss, for its own sales growth, for its own market penetration, et cetera. So it really operates as an autonomous unit within the larger corporate structure. So I'll give you three examples of CFBUs. So within Amazon, which is, of course, one of the largest companies in the world. So the Amazon Prime team is a cross-functional business unit. It has its own engineers to build the platform features. It has its own marketers who acquire and retain subscribers. It has its own data scientists to analyze and optimize recommendations. It has its own customer service people. It has its own product managers in finance, right? And Amazon Prime operates as it's sort of it's a division of Amazon, but it's a self-contained division. Okay, so this is one that you would say is probably designed around a particular customer segment. Okay, and it's been an enormously successful program. I've been an Amazon Prime subscriber for, gosh, 20 years, I think, since shortly after the program was developed, right? And it's because of the perks that I get for that, somewhat nominal subscription fee. Okay, so that's one example. An example around a product is Apple's iPhone product unit, which is also a cross-functional business unit. So it has its own hardware developers, software developers, designers, marketers, supply chain managers, okay, and finance. They all operate in a single dedicated unit that focuses specifically on the development and enhancement of the iPhone within the overall Apple company structure, okay? And again, because they can focus on that one product, okay, they can move much more quickly and surely in terms of making the iPhone successful. Okay, and then finally, an example of regional CFBU. So Unilever has organized itself geographically. So, for example, there's a Latin America unit in Unilever, right? And it handles all the aspects of the product portfolio for that region: research and development, local marketing, local distribution, local finances. And the reason Unilever does that is so it can respond to local tastes and needs, right? So what people in Latin America want is different than what people in China want, for example, right? So they have very different consumer tastes, different taste buds, even, right? So this allows Unilever to be much more responsive worldwide by having regional CFBUs to handle its business, focused on a particular, you might say it's a particular customer segment, but it's really, in this case, it's geographical. Okay, let's take a quick sponsor break. America is a maritime nation. Our freedom and security depend on strong sea services. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League stands with our Navy, Marine Corps, Coast Guard, and Merchant Marine through community support, education, and advocacy. For over 120 years, Americans of all walks of life have heeded our call. No prior military service is required to join our mission. The Beverly Hills Council of the Navy League of the United States. Help us support those who serve at sea. Visit NavyLeague.org. Okay, we're back. This is Business Lessons from the Military. I'm your host, Kevin Bemmel, and we're talking about the case for cross-functional business units. And I'm using as sort of the predecessor, if you will, the Emperor Napoleon's core system that he developed in the early 19th century that revolutionized the way that wars were fought, and made Napoleon one of the most successful generals, or he was actually a field marshal, of all times. Okay, so I talked about what the core system was and what cross-functional business units are. So why do we use cross-functional business units? Well, We use them to be more responsive to customers and markets. We use them to improve innovation, speed, and execution. We also create them to demonstrate clear ownership of a product or initiative, right? So going back to the Apple's CFBU of the iPhone, right? So the iPhone team, and when I say team, we're talking about, of course, a huge number of people, but the iPhone team, they own the success or failure of the iPhone. Okay, so there's greater accountability. And then lastly, it reduces internal friction across departments, right? So the iPhone has its own marketing people, its own R&D, et cetera. I talked about that before the break. Now, the thing is, and this is another aspect of using cross-functional business units, and that is, just because a CFBU has its own, let's say, marketing people, that doesn't mean they are completely siloed off from the marketing department at the corporate level. To the contrary, they have that marketing department to reach back to for consultation, for specific expertise that they may need on a short-term basis, or they may have that the corporate marketing team to available to work with in order to do cross marketing functions with other CFBUs. Okay, so it's not that a CFBU is completely siloed off from the corporate unit. It's that it has a great deal of autonomy, even as it has the ability to reach, sort of out to the corporate level when it needs those resources to be more effective. And that's exactly how things worked with Napoleon's core system as well. So it wasn't that his core commanders could not interact. It's not that they had no connection to command headquarters for the entire army. They did. It's just that they had a lot more autonomy in the field and execution, and they could call upon higher headquarters for the support they needed, as opposed to having it dictated to them. And so that back and forth made them much more effective than armies had been previously. Okay, so I'm going to talk about the relevance of the Napoleon's core system to cross-functional business units. So modern business, as you know, faces challenges of speed, adaptability, responsiveness, okay, just like an army in the field. And I've mentioned this a number of times on this show, but I think this is a good time to remind. I don't look at business as a war fighting function. Okay, business is not the existential human endeavor that war is. Having said that, there are aspects of business and how leadership works and how things function that are very similar to how militaries function even in wartime. Okay, of course that's the basis for the show, but I don't view business as a cutthroat, kill or be killed, endeavor. Quite to the contrary, I view business as a collaborative endeavor. Okay, so let's look at some analogies then between cross-functional business units and Napoleon's core system. So first of all, there's autonomy with alignment. Okay, so the core that made up Napoleon's army, they were independent, but they operated under his overall strategy. Okay, and so while CFBUs have their own product managers and marketing departments and development and operations, et cetera, so they can act quickly. Still, they follow the overall corporate company strategy, and their goals align with the goals of the company. Okay, so they're somewhat autonomous from, but not completely independent from the corporate structure, right? So the idea is to give them a much greater level of independence in pursuing their goals, but they're not detached divisions oftentimes. Okay, so that's the first thing: autonomy with alignment to the larger goals and objectives of the company. Okay, next is end-to-end capability. So Corps had the ability to fight independently. They had their own infantry, their own artillery, their own logistics, their own cavalry. Okay, so they, they could fight as integrated units. They didn't have to rely on higher headquarters, for example, for artillery support, which is how things were generally handled prior to the development by Napoleon of his corps system. So CFBUs also have end-to-end capability. So they're not reliant for any function on higher headquarters, on the corporate part of the company. They have everything they need within their unit. Okay. Now, again, as I mentioned a few minutes ago, that doesn't mean they can't reach back to corporate if they need some additional support. Okay. That certainly is the case. But generally speaking, they are self-contained and they have end-to-end capability. That's what gives them the autonomy and the flexibility that they need to respond to the challenges of whatever their the thing on which they're focused. Okay, so end-to-end capability. Next, number three, they have decentralized decision making ability. Okay, so corps commanders could issue orders and could launch offensives, could go on the defensive, whatever was required, without waiting for orders from higher headquarters. Okay, and so at the same time that they could take advantage of a breakthrough and push forward more quickly without waiting for permission from Napoleon's headquarters to do so. Also, if they were facing a situation where they were likely to maybe be badly mauled or wiped out, so they could also retreat without waiting for a permission from higher headquarters in order to maintain the integrity of their core and live to fight another day. Okay, now that isn't to say that um, higher headquarters couldn't order them to do something. Of course they could. So as Napoleon watched an overall battle develop, he could issue an order to a corps saying, I need you to stand and fight no matter what, right? And since the corps commander it can see his part of the battlefield, but generally does not see the overall battlefield, he's going to respond to what he knows. But there were times when the most senior commander, Napoleon, who did have cognizance over the overall battle, would issue orders that the corps had to follow. And that's why the corps had operational authority, and tactical authority, but strategic direction was held by Napoleon at higher headquarters. So um, cross-functional teams too, one of the major reasons for forming them is that they can make faster decisions without bureaucratic delays. So they don't need to wait for corporate approval of a particular marketing initiative. Okay, so they can make their marketing plans, they can make their sales plans, they can make their product development plans without everything getting approved at a higher echelon. Okay, now again, that's not to say that they're never told that they need to do something. So there may be some kind of cross promotion going on with, say, iPhones and iPads. Okay, and so a directive like that might come from corporate headquarters. Okay, in which case they'll need to cooperate with CFBU for the iPad, let's say, okay? And then there may be a coordinating function by corporate, okay? But in general, cross-functional business units are designed to make faster, more agile decisions without the bureaucratic delays of having to get approval at a higher level. Okay, next is number 4, scalability and flexibility. So depending on the threats and the conditions on the larger battlefield, Napoleon could move or combine corps in order to best meet the objectives that he was seeking to attain. Okay, so by having these essentially autonomous units, he could kind of mix and match them to more effectively deal with the developing battle situation. Okay, and and CFBUs can be handled the same way. So they can be scaled up, they can be scaled down, they can, resources can be redeployed, they can be realigned to address market changes, and they can just be much more flexible than having to turn the entire company. Okay, and that's why this concept was developed, within the business world, the cross-functional business units. Okay, so the ability for them to evolve or even revolutionize, how the business is approaching its market, okay, is much greater with a CFBU than it is for the company as a whole. And then finally, number 5, accountability and performance. So uh, Napoleon knew that with his core system, okay, he could hold a corps commander responsible for the success or failure of that corps, of that corps fighting within the overall battle. Okay, so a corps commander could not, turn back to higher headquarters and say, well, I was told to do X, Y, and Z. I did it, and it didn't work out, but I'm not responsible. No, it didn't work that way. So the key to the core system was the corps commander would be given objectives, and then he was responsible for meeting them. If he didn't meet them, then Napoleon could fire him and promote a new corps commander. Okay, and the idea of sort of building this meritocracy of leadership within armies was something new for its time. Okay, so and it really created a sort of dispersal of authority and accountability within the way an army was organized. So, and again, I'll go back to the example of Patton, right? If he had a corps that wasn't doing what it needed to do, he could fire that corps commander and appoint someone else. If there was a division within the corps that was not pulling its weight, so the corps commander could fire that divisional commander and replace him, but because he was accountable for his division's performance, and so on down the line, regiments, battalions, companies, even down to platoons. Okay, so the whole system of accountability based on performance came out of Napoleon's core system. Okay, and so you see the same thing in CFBUs, in these cross-functional business units. So corporate headquarters can have, president of the, iPhone, BF, CFBU, right? And the president of that business unit, that cross-functional business unit, is responsible for its success or for its performance. If it does well, hey, good. If it doesn't do well, he'll most likely be fired or reassigned, and someone who can produce better performance, will take over, right? And so having this greater accountability within a business structure is very valuable because um, I mean, you can structure compensation plans based on it, and you can also demonstrate to people within the CFBU that their individual performance really matters within the larger CFBU structure. Okay, so they will be held accountable and they'll be rewarded, for success, and they'll be held responsible for lack of success. Okay, so the two are as closely aligned. The two meaning Napoleon's core system and cross-functional business units are, as aligned as they can be in terms of how they can make, on the one hand, an army, and on the other hand, a company more effective. Now, you may be listening to this and thinking to yourself, well, wait a minute, I don't have a huge corporate structure. I have just a small company, and I can't have multiple marketing departments. Gotcha. I'm there, right? I'm a small businessman myself. However, even with this in a small company, maybe you have a team of I should say a marketing team of 3 people. Okay, and maybe your entire company is 20 or 25 people, so it's a relatively small business. Okay, within that, you could still develop, I wouldn't call it a cross-functional business unit, but maybe a cross-functional business team, right? Where maybe you take one person from each department and create an autonomous or semi-autonomous team within your company that focuses, for example, on new product or new service development, or focuses on a particular customer segment or client segment, right? So the same system can be scaled down based on the size of your company, and it can be enlarged as your company grows. Okay, so I've been talking, of course, on armies. We're talking about hundreds of thousands of people, and in fact, the armies that took the field in World War II, have an army of 1 million soldiers. Okay, obviously, the core structure is, in the context of modern warfare, is essential. You could never operate an army of 1 million people effectively with the old 18th century command structure. Okay, but you see the same thing happening in armies that I was just describing for the civilian world. So you'll see, for example, SEAL teams, right? SEAL teams they're kind of like a cross-functional business team within the military. They're small, they have integrated capabilities that allow them to do things quickly, effectively, agilely, okay, with a dispersed command structure. Okay, and so within our companies, we can develop, like I said, I would call them CFBTs, cross-functional business teams, and they can create a situation that allows our company to be more agile, to develop new products and services more quickly, to respond to market conditions more agilely. Okay, so even for a relatively small business, 15, 20, 30 person business, this concept can be adapted and used very effectively. So I thank you very much for joining me today. If you have any comments, thoughts, please post them on our social media. All the links will be in the show notes after the show posts on YouTube. And do me a favor, if you like the show, tell your friends about it. Let them know that this is a place to come for ideas, that can make their businesses better, and also learn something about the military history and doctrine and command structure. And I'd really appreciate that. So thank you to my live viewers, including, I hope I'm not mangling your name, Dikusuka Moses, who's watching live from Uganda. Cheers. And I thank you all very much for joining me. Real quickly, tomorrow at 10 a.m. Pacific time is my show, People Making Money. And then on Thursday at 5 p.m. Pacific time is my every other week show, Jiggers' Place, where we talk about all the things in life that are non-finances related. So I hope you'll join me on Thursday, 5 p.m. Pacific time, for a cocktail and a schmooze, as I like to say. And then next week on Monday at 10 a.m. Pacific time will be my show, Trusts and Estates Weekly. And then a week from today, I'll be back for the next edition of Business Lessons from the Military. So I thank you very much again for joining me, and signing off as I always do. Marie, darling, you are my belle. Courage at all times, my friends.